Yo, what's going on? Not here. Essentially, this week I've been working on a spreadsheet for my guild to help out with loot council decisions, etc. And I just wanted to share with you my thoughts on Phase 1 class priors for loot. I'll say it now, and I mean it, this is going to be a long one. If you're here to hear about every single item, get a drink and snacks, get comfy, put me on a second screen, we're going to be here for a long while. If you're looking for specific high profile items, I've noted a few timestamps in the description to make it easier for you. A couple quick caveats, and they're quite important to listen to before we get stuck in. Class priority is not the only metric worth using. It's obviously crap if Timmy gets the loot over Jimmy, but Jimmy's the only one attending raids consistently. Likewise, I don't know that Jimmy already has the second best item for the slot, and Timmy has a green. I can't know those factors, so we're just focusing on the single factor of class context. Importantly, this discussion is guild centric and looks ahead to phase 2 a little bit in some areas, with min-maxing both loot and performance over time. In short, this is through the lens of a pretty long-term approach to guild management that seeks to be fair with people who are in it for the long haul. Also, a large chunk of phase 1 raid gear is from a 10-man raid, so accessibility is super high and you can reasonably adjust your Karazhan groups to fit the gear needs of your players. So don't get too stuck on class priors for 10-man content. At the end of the day, we will have done so much Karazhan by the end of phase 1, probably on several characters, that everything will work out as far as Karazhan loot goes. Of course, this is also just my thoughts, one person. I am by no means treating this as a guide. This is just a discussion based on the various things I have learned in seeking out a reasonable loot council aid for my guild. If you have any compelling difference of opinion with good logic, feel free to express it. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, some specs don't have a proper sim tool right now, and will not have a sim tool in time for week 1 TBC it seems. As such, there's some lesser reliability for those specs. If sweeping changes are needed later on once we have more sim tools, I will update this accordingly with a new video. By phase 2 and tier 5 priority, I'm pretty sure things will have cleared up for that. So, with that out of the way, let's get stuck, otherwise we're going to be here all day. Alright, so this brings us to, finally, Growl's Lair. And sadly, despite there being less items in Growl's Lair and Magtheridon's Lair, there's a lot more discussion, specifically with the tier tokens, but not exclusively those. So let's take it step by step. Feel free to take a break at this stage, like if you need to go get a new cup of tea or coffee, whatever your jam is, maybe a beer. Go for that now, because even though we're through Karazhan, which has the most loot, we're not through. We're not close to being through, unfortunately. Alright, so I hope you refreshed yourself. This is the best cloak outside of the Doomlock Kazakh cloak if you're not interested in the hit from the Ruby Drape of the Mysticant, or, as we mentioned with the Shadow Cloak of Dalaran, if you're actually interested in crit itself. So if you're not an Affliction Warlock, if you're not a Shadow Priest, and if you're not desperate for hit, this is your cloak. Again, I'm going to sound like some sort of covert elemental agent, but Elemental Shaman is a good call here, as is Arcane Mage, as is probably Boomkin. Obviously, Boomkin is not stellar on DPS, but again, you're not prioritizing them much anywhere else. So again, to some degree, you need to throw people a bone. There's min-maxing, and then there's like min-maxing, right? And to my mind, this is something where you can be open-minded. Elemental Shamans stick out, but Arcane Mage, Boomkin, they're going to need the spell crit early on because their hit situation's pretty nice. Then you're looking at the rest if their hit situation's looking good. Belt of Divine Inspiration. Now this is really good, it's just that there is better that is crafted. Interestingly though, because of the lack of crit or hit, this kind of fits into that mold of an Affliction / Shadow Priest item. Now, don't get me wrong, Shadow Priests and Affliction Monks, I believe, do actually prefer Girdle of Ruination just about, even though they lose a tiny bit of spell damage for some crit, because of the fact that it's really close. So I would go here with Affliction and Shadow Priest. It just makes sense. Again, similar to what we discussed with Ritzins, with the Shadow Cloak of Dalaran. This fits their gearing profile a lot better than others. Outside of that, if you're min-maxing, or expecting your raiders to min-max, you're giving this to the guy who can't afford Girdle of Ruination. Kind of. That's pretty much where it stands as far as the broader picture is concerned. Now, Malefic Mask of Shadows. This is potentially the best in slot Helm for enhancement. It's a little unclear, as I mentioned. There's a few configurations that seem to be pushing very similar numbers, but overall this is undoubtedly best placed on an Enhancement Shaman because it is, or is very close to, the best option, which cannot be said for any other spec, and this stems from the extreme dislike of the Phase 1 metagem options that Enhancement has, which is less of a prominent issue for rogues, druids, etc. So whilst this isn't a premier item, broadly speaking, it is a top item for an Enhancement Shaman for Phase 1, and you should prioritise it this way. Maulgar's Warhelm. Very underwhelming. Similar to most items that lack gem sockets, it's a bit underwhelming. They could have buffed this quite substantially, and it still probably wouldn't be the best option for anyone. Bladespire Warbands. This is slam dunk, DPS warriors, rep paladin, and cheekily, if your prop warrior is gearing really efficiently and is really comfortable on their survival, this is really good for their threat as well. The double socket, some crit. It's got not great stamina and obviously no defensive stats, but it's a really nice, it's like the best efficient slot to gain some threat, at least for Phase 1, just because there is limited threat options. So keep that in mind. Before they go to Void Crystals, definitely shove it on your prop warrior, because it is pretty good if they're trying to pump some threat. Hammer of the Naru. This one is pretty much very close to Gorehau. It's a bit worse, I believe, at least on EP. Again, there's no sim tool. On EP, it's a little bit worse, because 3 sockets versus 42 agility, I believe it is on Gorehau, something like that. It is dubious, which is better. I think the Gorehau edges it, but I could be wrong. Either way, it's a pretty good Rep Paladin 2-hander. Again, has no real candle to hold against Lionheart Champion, or I believe actually someone told me that it might be that they use the mace smithing for blacksmith. But basically, if you're a blacksmith, this is not as good. But if you aren't, it's a decent option, and it's pretty much the only choice. Maybe an Enhancement Shaman for some BG shenanigans with the 2-hander stuff. I have seen that on YouTube, that's pretty fun. But for PvE, Rep Paladin or bust, kinda. This brings us to shoulder tokens. Now, shoulder tokens are perhaps the most contested set of tokens in all of Phase 1. So, buckle up for this discussion. For Fallen Champion, it's really close because so many specs want their tier 4 shoulders from the champ token. The only thing that really sticks out is that rogues don't want it. As mentioned, Waste Walker set is the 2-piece bonus is very desirable for them according to the sim tools, and they run shoulders gloves to achieve that. So they're in the bottom priority bracket. Excluding them is the quickest way to get to the overall point I'm trying to make straight away. So we'll start with the people we're not giving the token to, and that is the rogues. From there, things get tricky, but I think if you're being very, very raid-centric, you're looking at your Enhanced and Elemental Shamans. Not only are they the best item in that slot for that phase, but the 2-piece bonuses you're investing in are relevant DPS gains for several players, not just the Shaman. Kind of how we spoke about the Elemental Shaman's Helm token. It really is a huge boon as far as raid DPS goes to slam that 2-piece onto your enhancements and your elementals, particularly the elementals. That's slightly bigger, actually probably considerably bigger, but the enhancement one is not bad by any means. And so, given how desirable tier 4 shoulders are for pretty much all specs, you'd go for the DPS Shamans first. For my money, they are the best raid perspective options right away. And if I had to choose between the two, I would go Elemental first, because if we are assuming you kill all these bosses in linear order, you've hopefully put the Helm token on your Elemental Shaman, and as such we have, the shoulders immediately boom, 2-piece, right? So that's kind of where I'm thinking, because Enhance wants the chest token in the ideal setup, as far as I know. They're not getting the 2-piece quickly if things go perfectly, is what I'm saying. But either way, I'd go Elemental first here, but it's splitting hairs. A quick note as well, if your Resto Shaman is doing the 2-piece Elemental thing that I mentioned before for the raid DPS increase, put them in this top prior bracket also. Moving into the second or middle bracket on priority, there is the Prot Paladin, which has a slight edge over the other two. So you've got Prot Paladin and the 2 healer specs, and particularly Prot Paladin itemization is mostly arse, like just straight arse, a bit like Ferals, right? I was talking about how desperate they are to get all their tier pieces. Prot Paladin isn't much different, and obviously gearing up your tanks does have quite substantial benefits for threat, for survivability, eases the healer mana, whatever. Like, there's loads of reasons to favor your tanks somewhat. And in the case of Prot Paladin, it's similar to Feral. Itemization really stinks generally, and the tier really helps to alleviate these issues. So it's super impactful, and I would put them slightly ahead of the 2 healer specs. The healers do want tier 4 shoulders, but Primal Mooncloth does exist and offers an alternative, albeit it's profession locked, right? So I don't want to be too strict with this. I'm just saying that I would give a slight edge to Prot Paladins just because they don't have any other options that are comparable. But if you don't have tailoring on your healers, that's not a problem. There's plenty of reason not to be tailoring on those 2 healers, but I would edge the Prot Paladin here, just slightly. And obviously that bottom bracket with 0 priority, or at least the lowest priority, is Rogue. Moving on to the Fallen Defender token, and I promise, not because I'm a Feral Druid, it follows the same theme. It's a little bit less competitive than the Fallen Champion token, thankfully. And the similar theme, of course, is that Feral Druids really want these shoulders. They want them even more than the other slots, and that is because the shoulders are this for both pure DPS and mitigation and for threat. They're just the best shoulders, like point blank, no questions asked. And this is again one of the few areas you're going to give them some priority on an actually contested item. So you can't really go wrong with giving this to a Feral Druid early on. Following this bracket, like this top priority of Druid, you're looking at Prot Warriors, non-tailoring Resto Druids, and non-tailoring Holy Priests. The upgrade from Mantle of Abramis, or worse, to the Tier 4 Protection Warrior shoulders is substantial, and there aren't many realistic options outside of those 2 things. As such, I'd put the Prot Warriors slightly ahead of the healer specs, again, using that very slight tank prior, just a tiny little slither. I know some people go really ham on tank prior. If that's you, then it's a clear decision. For me, I'm not massive on tank prior, but I do consider it to be beneficial in some areas, and this is the one where, without comparable options, you definitely, I think, give a slight edge, especially if your Prot Warrior is your main tank. And to be honest, if you're running a Prot Warrior, they're your main tank, because that's kind of the only role they would do okay in. And again, the healers have that loose caveat that Mooncloth shoulders do exist. It's not fair really, because there's good reason not to be tailoring, as I mentioned. But again, if they are tailoring, this really reduces the priority then. This leaves Boomkin, DPS Warriors and Shadow Priests. Boomkin is definitely higher priority than Shadow Priest, because Boomkin tier 4 shoulders are their best option, and a serious Shadow Priest will be tailoring, and they'll use Frozen Shadow Weave shoulders for far longer than Phase 1. The reason Boomkin is lower is because the real gain from their tier 4 is mostly in mana regen. If you look at just DPS stats, their pre-raid options aren't too far behind. It's just that they gain some mana back from the set bonus and from the MP5 and the Spirit. So it's not, bad to give them it, like it's important, it's going to help them. But it's a minor gain, right? It's a minor gain. The difficult part is the DPS warriors. The tier 4 shoulders are very similar in value to bladed shoulder pads of the Merciless, and their set bonuses aren't so hot. So after your enhancement shamans on bladed shoulder pads, you're probably looking at your warriors. On top of that, if world bosses are in play, Rip Fiend shoulder plates are a clear best in slot option for phase 1. So they're ahead of Shadow Priests, since they shouldn't use tier 4 shoulders, but probably on par, maybe a tiny bit ahead of Boomkin, but I want to emphasize how close this is. And the other factors like attendance, reliability, player performance are all very relevant in deciding between, say, Boomkin and your DPS warriors. Fortunately though, for the Pauldrons of the Fallen Hero, this one's a little bit clearer. Hunters don't use tier 4. I'm going to say that every single Fallen Hero token. So that scratches them out immediately. Then we have the Warlocks, who have an extremely good 2-piece bonus here, as well as BIS stats, at least for both versions of Destruction. Affliction should have a slightly lower priority here, just because of Shadow Weave being really good standalone, but the 2-piece obviously is reason enough to switch. This then leaves mages, who are only using the shoulders as a standard upgrade, no set bonus shenanigans, and the set bonus sucks anyway. There's definitely more nuance to the Destrolock situation. Flame capped up Fire Warlocks are seemingly going to be the best pumper of spellcasters, especially early, so you may want to prio the Fire Boys. But either way, you're looking at Destro Warlocks into Affliction Warlocks into mages. This just brings us now to Growl, and this starts off with an item that is not too great. It's essentially Unimend headdress from Netherspite, but worse unless you're a Shadow Priest. And in which case, this is not too bad if you don't have Spell Strike or tier 4. But you should probably get Spell Strike. There's no real other candidate. From a raid perspective, like loot council perspective, it's Shadow Priest or Void Crystal, kind of. Cowl of Nature's Breath. Worse than Badge, or the Badge's head rather I should say, tier 4, and the World Boss Helms amongst others. Nobody really cares about this one. It's not awful by any means, but just dunk it on the least geared person and move on. No real problem here. Gronn-Stitched Girdle. Okay, so this is quite heavily contested. Looks kind of innocuous, right? Pretty good belt, attack power, crit, two sockets, and then some stamina. But it actually ends up being one of the best belts, particularly for classes that either don't like agility too much, or at least aren't as big on agility as others, or they are desperate to drop hit, and that includes a few specs. Hunters stick out as they generally struggle to lower their hit, especially when running with a Boomkin, and don't get me started if it's Alliance side with a Draenei in the group, giving another 1% hit. Alongside being the best single target pumper, Hunters get the nod here over Enhanced Shaman. Another contributing factor is that Enhancement Shamans benefit from overcapped hit. So whilst this is their best belt, there are better options, or at least solid options, that aren't as bad as if a Hunter was wearing them, because overcapped hit for a Hunter is dead, whereas overcapped hit, or over soft capped hit I should say, for Enhancement is not dead. It's not as great, but it's still adding DPS. So I think Hunters edge it over Enhance here. Following Hunters and Enhancers though, then you've got your Plate Wearers and potentially your Feral Tank if they are seeking to gear for extreme threat. Plate Boys have a better belt in the Magtheridon Girdle available, and Feral Tanks are probably not going to gear quite this aggressively, but if they end up doing so, you would put them ahead of the Plate Wearers potentially as well, depending on what they already have equipped and how likely it is that they're going to get the next Magtheridon belt. But all in all, it is pretty much a Hunter enhancement kind of duopoly on this item for the most part. Rogues shouldn't be after this. They have a big extreme need for hit, as we've discussed, and there are several better options that provide plenty of hit. Gauntlets of the Dragon Slayer. Now, not awful for Enhance, but pretty far away from the top options for the couple of specs that might use it. Don't think too hard on this one. Potentially an early Void Crystal. Wind Shear boots they're okay. Now, I've made a big point of mentioning how an elemental doesn't really want hit rating. They do need a little bit, so these aren't bad by any means. They're good. But they'd much rather have Boots of Foretelling, because it has crit, 2 gem sockets, and 28, I believe, or 26 spell power. So they are better. They have a better secondary, they have slightly more spell power potential. But if they don't have those, these go there, essentially. Other than that, though, you're probably going to dunk these on off-spec, Shamans, because 10-man loot is very accessible. I'm sure your main spec elemental is going to get Boots of Foretelling relatively fast. Gauntlets of Martial Perfection. These are the gloves I was talking about in regards to Grips of Deafness. This is the reason why plate wearers don't have a particularly high priority on grips. Because even if grips end up simming ahead of these, the gap isn't going to be big. Just because of the fact that these are so much higher in stat budget. 36 strength is huge, 2 gem sockets and 23 crit. It's mind-boggling how good these are, at least from a stat budget perspective for phase 1. So, with that said, they're going to your plate wearers, obviously, it's plate. But again, I wouldn't differentiate between your DPS warriors and your rep paladins. Go with whatever fits on other criteria. Teeth of Growl is an easy one. It's really, really lackluster for rest of Shamans and Paladins, but exceptionally good for Druids and Priests in terms of the mana regen is off the chain kind of, or out of this world by comparison to most other options. Ember Spur is higher throughput though, and I could see a world where people forego Teeth of Gruul as Druids or Priests for the higher throughput of the Ember Spur Talisman. Either way, this can only realistically go on Druids and Priests first. Do the Ember Spur Talisman shenanigans later on. Do it later, towards the end of phase 1 is when you can start messing around with whether you want throughput or regen. Early on, this is going to your Druids and Priests, and later on, it's going to be a Void Crystal, or off-spec. The Eye of Growl. Now, I actually forgot to write notes about this one. That's kind of how somewhat forgettable it is. And the reason for this is that the passive healing just doesn't really work out too well. It's not that the proc is all that bad. It's okay as a proc. I mean, 2% is pretty low, but the actual proc effect is fine from a mana perspective. It's just that you're sacrificing so much static gain. You're sacrificing at least 26 healing from pre-raid options to gain this 2% proc chance. When you compare it to something like Lower City Prayer Book, which has a built-in 1-minute cooldown mana reduction for all your spells over 15 seconds, it just it works out in favor of Lower City Prayer Book on average. So this is to a healer without rep and without better options, or a Void Crystal. It's not particularly huge. Alright, deep breath, people. Deep breath. Dragonspine Trophy. Oh dear. Okay. Yikes. Here we go. So, I want to emphasize, again, the thing about no sim tools as of recording for some specs. But I think regardless, I have the correct ballpark. At least on class alone. I'm not saying, remember, I did caveat this whole video very carefully, saying class prio is not the only metric. Okay? Keep that in mind. But in terms of specifically class prio, I think I have the correct ballpark. Remember, context matters. I can't know the raid context. But based purely on class, Hunters first. Hunters go boom. We've said it before. And I'll explain a bit more, other than Hunters go boom. This is because they gain the second most raw DPS from DST as a class, or spec, whatever you want to call it, whilst having far more uptime because of the fact they have the luxury of ranged, especially when we move into phase 2 and tier 5 content, where it's actually, really difficult as melee to get good uptime. You see quite a big gap at the start of phase 2 Like, there's a gap already in phase 1, but there's quite a substantial gap at the start of phase 2 because of the fact that we're using phase 1 gear and the mechanics are pushing melee all over the place and hunters get to slap the boss regardless. So it is hunter prio. I obviously wouldn't want to just say hunter prio everywhere, but I'm being like as stingy as I can to hunters. But hunters go boom. Hunters have high uptime and they get the second highest raw DPS from it. So in that respect, DST goes hunters first. It's just resoundingly safe, essentially. Now, the problem here, as I'm sure you're aware, is that most raids in 25 mans are going to run 3 to 4 hunters. And this means if your loot council are sticking strictly to class priority, it's going to feel kind of bad, right? Because it means the first 3 to 4 DSTs just go to the same class. Now, if you're in like a giga guild, like, you know, the ones that are speed running, where everybody's on the same page, everyone only wants to blast, that is fine. But when you're looking at those slightly less hardcore, even if you're quite hardcore, if you're less hardcore than like super speeds and really trying to min-max, you know, raid performance to these really impressive degrees, it's rough, man, right? Like, this is a really iconic, really desirable item, and having sort of this locked in 3 to 4, first 3 to 4 going to the same class is going to feel really bad and maybe, you know, a difficult thing for harmony in terms of your raid team. So I do want to emphasize on a personal level that, you know, if you're not quite at that standard of really blasting super hard, I wouldn't be too strict on this. I would definitely give the first DST to a hunter, maybe even the second one. But that third and fourth, I think, from a raid perspective, unless you're getting really lucky with like consecutive Dragonspine Trophy drops, you really want to see a little bit of diversity. So, with that said, let's move on to what the safe second pick is. And there's 2 reasons why this is second. I'm not going to name it yet. You run one, pretty much only one, ever. You're already guessing it, I know, but you run one. And also, it has the highest DPS gain from DST, like of all specs. So assuming optimal uptime, which again is the main reason why hunters do get prior, because uptime is the main issue between ranged and melee, it's rogue. They get 95 DPS when fully raid buff in tier 4 bis. Dragonspine Trophy is almost 100 DPS. It's a no-brainer for me, not necessarily because I think rogues are fantastic or anything like that at this stage, but they don't replace it. Sword rogues will not replace DST. And they also, there's only one of them. You only have one mouth to feed. So that you only have to, like, you know, have your Enhanced Shaman suck lemons for 1 more week, right? Or 1 more DST. Because at that stage, you know, you're only, like I said, feeding one mouth is pretty easy. It doesn't have that bad feeling of 3 to 4 consecutive Hunter Dragonspine trophies, which wouldn't go down too well with some raid teams. So, again, use other criteria. But if you're nitpicking on class, Hunter into Rogue, and third is Enhanced Shamans, actually. Oh, dear God. I think I'm dead. Maybe not. Enhanced Shamans. So, in respect to Enhanced, they have a very clear DPS gain from this. And this is because they have a working sim tool, for one, and also Wind Fury, Haste, feels pretty good, man. You know, like it's a bit of a I know there's an internal cooldown, but it's a pretty blasty fun time, right? And DST gives 70 raw DPS in tier 4 bis, which will only go up as enhancement gets better, because their phase 1 itemization leaves something to be desired. There's definitely some interesting scaling, or upscaling I should say, once they get slightly better items in phase 2 and 3. But phase 2 is quite a big jump for some of the enhancement items. So Dragonspine Trophy is a safe pick at third. And for many raids, you're only bringing 1 or 2 enhancements. I've seen a lot of raid comps recently posted where many raid teams are choosing only 1 enhance. Again, that single mouth to feed aspect is quite a good thing for raid harmony. If you can justify it and say, hey, he's the only guy that's an enhancement, your class is next, or you're next, essentially, if you're talking with somebody who's the only one of their class or spec. So again, for me, definitely enhances third. I mean, I think this is a correct ballpark. Honest to God, I think with full like research and stuff like that, with the current information available, hunters, rogues, enhance. Following this, you have your plate wearers. Now, I think I can't know because Fury Warriors and Arms Warriors and Ret Paladins don't have sim tools yet, but I'm pretty sure you're prioritizing your Fury Warrior, followed by your Arms Warrior, followed by your Ret Paladin in that little 3 trio. I'm not saying it's a hard prio by any means, but hear me out here. In regards to Retribution Paladins, Tsunami Talisman's really good. It's not really good for certain other specs, like for Arms and Fury. Tsunami Talisman is a lot worse than it is on a Ret. Likewise, you're going to prio the Retribution Paladin on Tsunami Talisman. Quick, let me just find it real quick. I'm just going to struggle real quick. I know that now I'm on camera, I'm going to struggle to find it as far as it goes in terms of which boss it's from. Ah, here it is. Okay, so Tsunami Talisman. As you can see, big crit. Rets love crit, right? Bit of hit rating, probably not most really impactful, but chance on critical hit to increase your attack bar by 340 for 10 seconds. It's really good on a Ret Paladin. It's also really good on a Feral Druid, which we'll get to. But you're going to prioritize your Ret Paladin here. So forward thinking, guild management style, I think class priority wise, you put Ret Paladins behind your Warriors because your Warriors probably won't be using or getting Tsunami Talisman anytime soon. So in that respect, it kind of like is a trade-off, a bit like the Light Fathom Scepter thing. I'm not saying it's not BIS for Ret Paladins. Dragonspine Trophy is BIS for Paladins. But Tsunami Talisman will be their thing. It'll be their prio alongside Feral Druids. So there is that. On top of that, in Phase 2, as far as I'm aware, the Dark Moon cards release. And Dark Moon card Crusade is super good. So with that in mind, I would put Ret Paladins below your Fury Warrior and below your Arms. The reason I'd put Fury Warrior slightly higher is because, as far as I'm aware, again, no sim tool, Fury Warriors like haste a little bit more. It's as simple as that. Like, I think it's a tiny bit better on Fury Warriors, at least from a theoretical perspective. I'm happy to be proven wrong from a sim tool, but on raw DPS gain, I'm quite confident that a Fury Warrior is probably slightly ahead, so they would take the cake there. And then we have Feral Druids. And there is an okay reason to give this to Feral Druids. It is BIS. It's BIS for threat. It's BIS for Feral DPS. The problem is, haste isn't very good for Feral. Contrary to the MCP days of vanilla, where you're popping 50% attack speed, it doesn't work out as well anymore. And essentially, you're bottom prior. Like, you have to be. I don't think any guild that looks at these kinds of like things extensively is going to put a Feral anywhere near top priority. And it's not a slight to the Feral Druid. The Feral Druid is going to be top prior with Tsunami Talisman alongside the Ret Paladin, and that's because they crit loads. Feral Druids crit enormously often, and Tsunami Talisman is really good for them. So for them, they're going to probably go something like Tsunami Talisman, Bloodlust Brooch, into the Zalaman Berserker's Cool Trinket over Brooch. So, and that's assuming you don't get a DST. You might get a DST, but I'm pretty sure, unless you're blessed, you might never see a DST as a Feral Druid, and that is okay. Honestly, it is. It's BIS, but if you're looking long term, it's not the end of the world. Okay, so we're on to something a little bit more clear cut. It's still a big ticket item, for sure, but it's a sword. So we've got less options here. It's Bloodmaw Magus Blade, and this is what I was referencing in the Mind Blade discussion. This, like, the weapon type really screws around with this, but in this case, it can only go to mages, warlocks, or prop paladins, right? And I'll explain to you, beyond simply, oh, but DPS is more important. Beyond that, I'll explain to you why prop paladins should be lower priority. I mean, it's gonna not be rocket science, but I'll go through the motions to make sure no one is particularly upset. Is that, in terms of the mages and warlocks discussion, though, first and foremost, I think it's a difficult one in terms of you want more context But if you're being brutally strict, Destro Warlocks will be pumping harder in Phase 1. So your first few Magus Blades should probably go on your Warlocks, assuming you haven't done Mind Blade on them. You haven't given them Mind Blade. Essentially, Mind Blade does factor into this extensively. You're probably going to have 1 or 2, maybe even 3 Karazhan lockouts before your guild is clearing Growl. Not because of difficulty, more like logistics and everyone getting to 70. Not all guilds are super fast, but either way, however fast you get here, you might have a Mind Blade on a Warlock already, perhaps 2. If that's the case, perhaps you need to throw your mages a bone, because once you've got 1 or 2 Mind Blades on your Warlocks, you're probably considering, for fairness reasons, more so than performance reasons, to give it to your Elemental or your Boomkin or your Shadow Priest. Probably your Elemental, though, to be honest. Again, covert Elemental Agent, not over here, of course. But honestly, jokes aside, it's probably Destro Warlocks over mages, but mages are not bad. They pump pretty fucking good, and if you've got a couple Mind Blades and Warlocks already, no reason not to give it to a mage. Use other contexts quite heavily here. In regards to the prop paladin thing though, let's go through the motions, because giving this to a prop paladin may cause drama, and that's not good for a guild, right? Like in general, it's just not good. I can understand why a prop paladin would really want this. Look at the speed. Below 2 seconds, which is great. It's got good damage on it. Spell crit's not fantastic, but it works. It's got decent stamina intellect. It's great, right? But you're realistically leaning on your prop paladin more so in Phase 2. Like in Phase 1, they have a role, they do a good job, blah blah blah. But in Phase 2 is when you start looking at your prop paladin to really shine. It's got some really key niche roles from Phase 2 onwards. Phase 2, Phase 3. And the important thing there is that your paladin simply needs to stack marks. And there is honor resets between phases, I'm assuming. But if not, stack honor. And just pick up the Gladiator's Gavel, which is very similar in power level to this. In fact, I believe it has more spell damage and has the right speed. So even if you cannot get to Gladiator rating in Season 1 for Phase 1, which would be your BIS if you can, if you're God tier, well not even God tier, if you can get to 2050 or whatever it is for the PvP mace, that is the prop paladin BIS. If you cannot though, you're looking at this as your Phase 1 BIS, but the thing is, the moment you start becoming more important to the raid, or even more important to the raid, whatever you want to call it, Gavel becomes available for honor and marks, because Season 2 will bring Season 1 gear to a vendor for honor. Just buy it. Like, I know it sounds ridiculous, but like when Phase 2 hits, walk to the vendor, and if they reset honor, go farm some honor and buy it before the raid starts. Like, maybe you have to do one raid without a Magus Blade, potentially. Like, it's not the end of the world. Like, hopefully you do get one. If you can't get the Gladiator 1 Season 1, hopefully enough Magus Blades drop to give to the prop paladin. But if they don't, it's not the end of the world. The moment you get to the stage where you really need to be blasting threat and doing a good job and all that stuff and having your supreme niches, you can pick up Gladiator's Gavel really, really easily. And that's something I think all classes should be aware of. If you get unlucky, or weapon priority doesn't favor you and not enough of them drop, etc., Season 2 brings pretty, like, Gladiator weapons are good. Even going into Tier 5 content, if you pick up a Season 1 healer weapon or Season 1 Gladiator's Cleaver for your Enhancement Shamans, if you pick that up week 1 with your marks, honor, etc., you're golden, man. Who cares what happened in Phase 1? Phase 2 is the real content, right? Focus on that, honestly. Phase 1 content is going to be a waiting room for real content. I know it sounds really pessimistic. I'm excited for it, by the way. I'm just saying, like, the reality is you're not going to see any, like, real big sort of, like, needs for these pumper items until Phase 2, and that's when you might start thinking, damn, I could really do with a really good weapon. And again, stopping the ramble here, because I've noticed myself going off script here, but honestly, prop paladins, you want this, but don't be upset if you don't get this. You can easily rectify the issue as soon as Phase 2 lands. Axe of the Gronn Lords, trash, basically. I don't know what to say about this one. This is a Void Crystal. Aldori Legacy Defender. the best shield in the game for phase 1. For both. It's perhaps a tiny bit better for your prop warrior, because hit rating is more impactful to their threat than a prop paladins. They're more impacted by spell damage, for example. But with that said, best for both. So either one works. Wouldn't necessarily do a hard pro here, but if your main tank's a prop warrior, go prop warrior first probably. But it is what it is. Shuriken of Negation, I guess PvP, like early on. I don't know. This is not fantastic. This is below the sort of Karazhan statistics. So yeah. Now let's move on to the leg tokens. Now let's move on to the leg tokens. And fortunately, this one's pretty quick. I'm not going to keep you here long on the leg tokens, because very few specs like the tier 4 legs, because they have no gem sockets. It's that simple. Gem sockets OP. So, Fallen Champion, clear cut. Rogues and Shamans entirely will not use tier 4 legs as any part of any best setup for phase 1. In fact, in many cases, the legs are just not all that great regardless of whether it's BIS or not. Lack of gem sockets being the primary reason, as mentioned. Holy Paladins will also not use these, as there are several better options, such as the Heart Flame leg plates, or leggings rather, and leg plates of the Innocent from Karazhan, which we've discussed already. This leaves us with Rep Paladins and Prop Paladins. Rep Paladins will probably use these over Skulkers, just about, to obtain a 4-piece set bonus, assuming that is BIS. I mean, again, no sim tool, I'm kind of anxious to say that, but I think that's where the play is. Whilst Prop Paladins will probably only use the tier legs as part of their threat set, because the Curator legs are far and away really awesome for mitigation. So overall, you're looking at Rep Paladin with a slight edge over Prop Paladin into basically nobody will want it. It's going to be a dead token pretty fucking fast. Fallen Defender. Similar to other Defender tokens, Feral Druids are super into this and should have priority. Notably different from other tokens though, is that this token has pretty much zero demand outside of the Feral Druid, like literally zero. The lack of gems really hurt the legs as a standalone item, and to be honest, after Feral Druid, this token can go anywhere. Leggings of the Fallen Hero. Literally nobody. Literally nobody. Like, this is collection purposes / not min-maxing / slacking, whatever you want to call it, whether you're super into min-maxing or not. This is a very weak token. The demand for this is really weak. You don't need to think too hard. People shouldn't get upset over this one. And this brings us finally to Magtheridon's Lair. Now, Cloak of the Pitstalker is essentially a worse Vengeance wrap. It has big stamina on it, but doesn't have the gem socket that is a red socket, which does help with a little set bonus too, a gem socket bonus. So the demand for this will correlate with the degree of Vengeance wraps that you have crafted in your raid. Hopefully, by the time you're slapping Magtheridon for the average guild, you'll have several Vengeance wraps and nobody will want this. But if they don't have Vengeance wraps, this basically goes for the same specs that want Vengeance wrap. Enhance, Ret, Warrior. Again, I would definitely encourage Vengeance wrap. It's not too prohibitive. It's not cheap, but it's not prohibitively expensive, and it's very good. It makes you not have to think about Cloak for quite some time. Soul Eater's Hand Wraps. Now, these are the premier spell caster gloves for Elemental. Again, covert Elemental agent, not I guess, but no, for real. As I mentioned, the flowing hand wraps from Ataman, I believe it is, they're quite an efficient slot for hit. So a lot of the specs that still need a reasonable amount of hit are going there. Even though these are maybe a tiny bit better on EP, potentially at least, the other specs want to go for that little bit of hit, or they're using Spellfire. So this kind of leaves Elemental standing, twiddling their thumbs, saying, hey bro, how about me? And that's kind of where it is at. They're good for everybody, but they really do stick out as an Elemental item, because people are using Spellfire, people are using Hand Wraps of Flowing Thought, so it's definitely prior to Elemental here. Interestingly, if you do have a min-max comp where most people have Hand Wraps of Flowing Thought or Spellfire equipped and they do not need these as spellcasters, Holy Priest can use these very well. As we saw with the Saintly Blessings gloves from, I believe, Ataman again, they're not too much higher on healing. They both have 2 gem sockets, and in this case, if you're looking at just throughput and not like regen and longevity, the crit is more impactful than the spirit. So in that respect, it's very close. I still think you go for the Ataman gloves on average, but this could easily go to your Holy Priest. Lair's Tongue Gloves. These are best suited to Enhancement Shamans that are still waiting for Grips of Deafness. Most other specs have a preference for different options, such as Dexterous Manipulation or Martial Perfection, if they are in the Grips waiting room. So, it's not a fantastic item, by the way. I'm not sure. Maybe some enhancement mains will clarify this for me in the comments. I think it's pretty good for enhancement from what I can see, but not stellar. It's not perfect. You're looking at grips for enhance, you're looking for Wastewalker potentially for the 2-piece bonus, you're looking at potentially even tier 4 gloves like as part of the 2-piece bonus over these, but these are pretty good, at least on the EP that I can see, but then again they're not in the top options. So again, not a highly demanded item, is okay on your enhancement. Terapic Girdle, very underwhelming is what my note says. Probably avoid crystal target most of the time. Thundering Great Helm, awful item. Like, yeah, I don't know what to say. Like, sure, week 1, somebody might need it, but it's bad. It's bad. Avoid crystal. Girdle of the Endless Pit. This is the belt that the name escaped me when I was talking about it. But in terms of the belts, this is your plate belt, and it's far and away the best belt for plate wearers, for DPS at least. Again, if your prot wearer is super comfy, you could eventually give this for threat, but I believe the braces are slightly more efficient, given like balancing the defense threat kind of thing, but I'm not an expert. But overall, DPS plate item, the best DPS plate belt in phase 1, so go there. Now, here comes the prot paladin item, the biggest prot paladin item. This, no matter how good it looks, right? No matter how good that second equip looks, you're not putting this anywhere but prot paladin. Maybe if you're in a guild where you're clearing Magtheridon week 1, week 2, and somebody in your raid isn't hit capped for some reason, maybe this can go there too, but definitely prioritize your prot paladin. Now, are they going to wear it every single encounter? No. Eventually, I think they will, because the content, I'm not sure, will demand them. Once they get more gear, like phase 2 and stuff, this starts becoming more and more usable. Like, it's already usable straight away, don't get me wrong, but it's the amount of times you're going to gear for one trinket to be aggressive is going to increase rather than decrease over time. And Eye of Magtheridon is essentially perfect. Massive spell damage, right? 54 is huge as a stat passive, which is already good by itself, and perhaps a reason to give it to an undergeared spellcaster after your prot paladin, but the secondary effect is the real big one. It grants 170 increased spell power for 10 seconds when one of your spells is resisted. Now, let me be clear here, prot paladins do like spell hit where they can get it for threat, but they're never ever in a million years going to be spell hit capped. So you're going to proc this reliably and consistently over the course of the fight. It's great. It's great. Put it on your prot paladin. Caraborian Talisman. Similar to some other offhands, it's fine, but pales in comparison to the badge vendor offhands, basically. So anywhere will do. Glaive of the Pit. Very bad. Like, literally, I don't even know. There might be some weird quirky thing where it scales with spell power, but ret paladins don't use spell power anymore. So, yeah, I don't know. It's bad. Crystal Heart Pulse Staff. Now, this is an interesting one. It's a very good stave. It's not very fair to give a class pro here. It should probably go to whoever needs it the most. It probably is slightly better on a Resto Shaman that lacks Light's Justice. But in particular, you're splitting hairs because one hand and offhand generally just better. They're just better. So it's an awkward one to prio here. Just go for the biggest upgrade, honestly. It looks nice at the very least. Look at this one. People can't be too upset with that, right? Even though it's not Biss. Look at it. It's beautiful. So, at least compared to what we're used to, right, in Classic. So, just go with the best option available. Forget class on this one. Ages of the Vindicator. Now, this is basically about the same as the KT shield from vanilla. So if you already have the KT shield, you do not need this. But if you don't, this is your best shield. And for throughput, Tears of Heaven are a little bit better. But if you're a Shaman or Paladin, you probably want to wear a shield, and I don't blame you. This is it. This is the shield for phase 1. Unless you have that vanilla shield. Eridar Wand of Obliteration. This is lesser demanded than the Tirisful Wand we saw in Karazhan because it's an efficient slot to get hit. And as you can probably tell if you've played vanilla casters, these wands look awfully similar to how good the Naxxramas wand is. Like the late game Naxxramas wands in vanilla. And you'd be right. They're pretty close. And there's also, at least generally speaking, a slightly better wand that has the same stat profile, just a little bit different. I think it has 11 critical strike rating and 20 spell power, called the Blackstalk from the Underdog Heroic. So this is a great wand if you're in a good hit situation, which is probably your Arcane Mage in particular here. But the Blackstalk is, I think, a little bit better on average. Alright. Final stretch here, final stretch. Magtheridon's head, it's basically an Oni head without a buff. Or maybe there is a buff, maybe I'm wrong. Either way, it's an Oni head, basically. And you get these 4 rings. And I'll say it now, it's pretty close, but I'll try and, bring it to light as much as possible. But it's a difficult one. Band of Crimson Fury, let's look at that one first, because that's where my notes start. It's very efficient for hit rating and pretty much ends up being the Biss ring for pretty much all the casters besides the ones that despise hit. And that is pretty much just elemental. Like, even though Shadow Priest and Affliction don't need much hit, this is a very efficient way to get the hit that they do need. But the important part here is that the Cenarian Expedition ring isn't much worse. Also, the Cthulhu ring from vanilla is arguably better. And the Seal of Exorcist, which is a Spirit Shard vendor, which not too many people are familiar with. Essentially, you get Spirit Shards from killing bosses in Alkindun, however you pronounce it. And you get 1 per boss. For 50 shards, I believe it is, you get a really, really good ring that is really comparable to this. So whilst this is the very best caster ring in a vacuum, contextually it's a really awkward one because it's not far and away the best. It's a real small upgrade from some very easy to get items. So it's a massive caveat. It is the best caster ring, and casters, as we know, blast in this expansion, right? You really want to feed casters, but it's not big. It's not big. So then we move on to something like Ring of the Recalcitrant. I need to Google what that word even means. But anyway, this is pretty much reserved as the only agility ring that doesn't have hit on it. In fact, I think outside of the strength ring we saw earlier in Karazhan, this is the only ring for physical damage dealers that doesn't have hit on it at level 70. And that's literally where all the value is. If you run a Boomkin, your hunters need this because they've got hit coming out of all orifices, alright? And in that setting, because they can't utilize overhit, like extra hit, they really are desperate for this ring just to alleviate some of the gearing pressure, or at least just alleviate the dead stats that they have. And with that in mind, though, it's not huge. Like, as much as it is better than having overhit with Garona's Signet, it's not crazy big. So, again, it's not super compelling, but I think you do go Hunter here if you're running a Boomkin. If you're running Boomkin and Draenei, you definitely, I think, go Hunter here just slightly. Just slightly. But again, it's not the end of the world wherever you go. I think the other contextual aspects really do matter a little bit more, personally. Perhaps just gauge people's interest. Like, all of these 4 have good use cases and good reasons. And none of them are particularly massive. None of them are like, whoa, that's huge. So again, use other contextual things, maybe even just canvas people to see who's really interested. But I think your hunters in a min-max comp will be very interested in this because of all the hit issues that they have in terms of overhit. Now next up we got Naru's Light Wardens band, or Naaru Light Wardens band. And this is a pretty good ring. It definitely favours Paladins and Shamans, though it is exceptionally good for all healers. The problem is that healers do have quite a few options that are relatively similar, and they're not going to use the Light Wardens band for too long in the case of Priests and Druid. So your Shamans and Paladins might have quite a big demand for this, but by and large, it's not huge, right? Like it is their BIS, I believe, unless they're doing World Boss loot, which has the flowing light ring from, I believe it's Kazakh. That is better, but this is a close second or third option depending on which spec we're talking about, and ultimately it's just a bit awkward to like really prioritize a healer item when it's not huge. It's okay to prioritize healers at times, but it's just not big either, right? So then you're left with the tank ring, which again isn't big. The only real use case that really matters is your druid, because this ring is their best ring until Sunwell. So longevity kind of like pushes Feral up here, but as you've noticed, we've already walked past a ring that isn't too dissimilar to this, and there are very similar rings in the in the various places in the loot table in phase 1. You have the Sherman Great Ring, which we did see. There is one in Heroic Old Hillspread Foothills, not as good obviously. The Violet Signet is what you pair with this as a Feral Druid. So it's not crazy big, but this is very good and is the best option for a long ass time for Feral. So at least for Feral tanks. If you're Feral DPS, you're looking at Ring of the Recalcitrant, I believe. And even then, I'm not sure it's BIS for you. So I don't think, no, it's not BIS for you. So at that point, it is coming down to my mind, Hunters first, if you've got a Boomkin, and then you've got your casters, and this is going to be primarily your casters that don't have vanilla rings and that are playing specs that need hit, particularly Firelocks, particularly Fire Mages. You're going to have a lower priority on things like Arcane Mage. Your Elemental Shaman just doesn't want this, from what I understand. Wants just the crit rings. And then following that, I believe you're looking at your healers. The only thing I would note is, whilst it's a relatively small difference, like essentially, you probably want to get this on your Feral Druid in time for progress, the tank ring. So as a very loose sense, very loose, because I do think you should look at other contexts here. Ring of the Recalcitrant for your hunters, assuming you have a Boomkin. Followed by this caster ring for those who are not blessed with all the vanilla options, as well as the new options. Followed by probably Paladins, Shamans, first and foremost on this ring, but potentially your Druids and Priests too. And then the tank ring is definitely the lowest priority, especially when we're talking about Paladins and Warriors. In fact, Paladins might take the Crimson Fury ring for threat instead of this one. But Feral tanks definitely want this ring by the time you're progressing phase 2, because they're going to enchant it, or not to say enchant it, sorry, they're going to just blast it on and keep it on, pretty much progress all the way through to Sunwell. It's that simple. Now this brings us to the chest tokens, and it's a long one. Chest Guard of the Fallen Champion. Here we're looking at Prot Palas and Enhancement Shamans as your primary sort of like top option, and the reason for this is, again, similar to what I said about Prot Pala before. Itemization sucks balls, straight up. They do have a very good option for mitigation, but you're really, especially as you get through the Magtheridon stage, when you're actually progressing to a higher gear level and all your DPS are doing more damage, when your Prot Paladin does have to take over the main boss or the main target, you really don't want him to be slacking in threat, and the best way to give him threat is to give him pieces that both keep him alive, him or her I should say, or whoever, alive, as well as providing spell damage. It's really important. So The itemization thing, set bonuses, prop pala, really high priority here, to my mind. Enhancement Shaman follows closely, and this is again linked to that 2-piece set bonus. It is very useful, it's a good raid DPS increase. It is also their best chest outside of the world boss chest. So unless world bosses are in play, there's not even a second thought on this one. If world bosses are in play, perhaps your Enhancement Shaman is going to go for gloves or helm instead. Now, following this though, we have a number of specs: Rogue, Holy Pala, Rep Pala. And the reason for this is that Rogue needs it for the 2-piece bonus. Holy Paladin, the chest is far and away the best option. Whilst Rep Paladins, they do want the chest piece, but Terror Weave is better by a pretty good margin, assuming you can get world boss loot. So they are on the lower end of this middle bracket. Followed by Resto and Elemental Shaman, and that's because they're using the helm and shoulders to get their 2-piece bonuses instead. They just won't be using the chest, they'll be using leatherworking chests instead. In the case of Eli Shaman, Nether Strike is slightly better, but Windhawk is usable. For Resto, Windhawk is the way forward. Now we're on to Fallen Defender, and the whole Feral Shield thing is still going. Ferals will drop the soap for this token, and the itemization improvement is so vast that it's hard not to let them. Outside of Ferals being that desperate, all 3 specs of Warrior are interested in this, as are non-tailoring Holy Priests. If world bosses are in play, you definitely want to move your DPS warriors down, similar to Rep Paladin, because Terror Weave is very good for them, since they aren't looking for set bonuses too much. Serious Shadow Priests are going to have Shadow Weave, and as such, don't need tier 4. Whilst tailoring Holy Priests will get more benefit from using the Primal Mooncloth robe. Simple as that, really. Tailoring dunks on the priest robes. Now, moving on to chest guard of the Fallen Hero, it's very straightforward. Hunters won't use tier 4 at all, as I've mentioned. The Mage tier 4 chest has pretty bad itemization, and as such, Warlocks get prio here, as it's the best slot for them to get the 2-piece bonus along with the shoulders. I don't want to go into too much depth here because it would be pointless. The Mage robe is just not really good. Hunters just won't use the chest. Mages are obviously going to use Spellfire potentially as well. So ultimately, for your Warlocks, you probably want to put your Affliction Warlocks behind your Destro Warlocks in priority, but that's about everything. It was a super long video. If you made it all the way through, goddamn. But I hope it at least broadened your own view of how you might distribute loot on your response, or your response to loot distribution in your guild, I should say. For now though, as you might imagine, I'm spent. I'll see you next time, hopefully in your notifications.